The engagement party was in full swing, crystal chandeliers, 500 guests. In their finest, the kind of evening where everyone performs their best version of themselves. I had set up the tables myself that morning. I had carried the wine up from the cellar with my own hands. Then her fiancé grabbed that bottle, looked me dead in the eye, and poured it over my head. "Now you know where you stand," he said. I said nothing. I straightened my jacket. I walked out and made one phone call. "You're watching Dad's Revenge Stories, and I'm so thankful for your presence today. Let's connect in the comments. Tell me which city or country you're tuning in from right now." Before we proceed, please note, this narrative contains fictional elements designed for entertainment and education. Any similarity to living persons or locations is purely coincidental, but the underlying lesson remains profoundly useful. The fog was still sitting low over the hills when I turned onto Birchwood Lane that morning. It was the kind of fog that didn't burn off fast, the kind that settled into the grass and stayed there like it had nowhere better to be. I knew the feeling. I had left my apartment at 5:45 before the sun had any real intention of showing up, and driven the 40 minutes out to the estate in silence. No radio, no podcasts. Just the sound of the highway thinning out as the city fell behind me, and the particular quiet of a man who has learned that some mornings don't need noise added to them. The Miller estate sat at the end of a long gravel driveway lined with oak trees that Diana had insisted on planting the year we moved in. She said a house needed to earn its entrance. She was right about most things like that. The oaks were tall now, thick through the middle, their branches arching overhead so that driving beneath them felt like passing through something intentional, something that had been built to last. I parked near the service entrance and sat in the car for a moment. 40 years I had been coming to this house. First with my father, then with Diana, then with Chloe when she was small enough that I carried her up the front steps on my shoulder. Now I was coming alone at 5:45 in the morning to set up tables for my daughter's engagement party. I did not let myself sit too long. Sitting too long leads to thinking too hard, and thinking too hard before a day like this one was a luxury I could not afford. The catering crew was not due until 8. I had 2 hours. I found the key in my coat pocket, the old brass one my father had pressed into my palm the morning after his own father's funeral, and I unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The house smelled the way it always smelled in the early morning wood polish, and something faintly floral, probably the arrangements Chloe had ordered for the main room. I moved through the kitchen without turning on the overhead lights, just the small lamp above the stove, and set my thermos of coffee on the counter. The main hall was already half-dressed, white linen draped over 6 round tables, chairbacks tied with cream ribbon, crystal glasses standing at attention at every place setting, catching the weak gray light coming through the tall windows. Someone had done good work the night before. I started with the tables that were slightly off-center. It bothered me the way a crooked picture frame bothers a man who has spent his life building things with a level. I moved them by hand, an inch here, 2 inches there, until the spacing felt right, until the room looked the way it was supposed to look. Then I went down to the wine cellar. My father had started the collection in 1971. I had added to it over the years, quietly, the way I did most things. There were bottles down there that other men would have put in a display case and talked about at dinner parties. I kept them in the dark where they belonged, and brought them out only when the occasion was worth it. I found what I was looking for on the 3rd shelf from the bottom. A 2009 Chateau Margaux, one of only 4 bottles I had left from a case I had purchased the year Chloe graduated from Harvard. I had been saving them. I was not entirely sure what for until now. I carried the bottle upstairs with both hands and set it on the kitchen counter beside my thermos. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out the envelope. It was a standard white envelope, letter-sized, sealed. Inside was a single document, the certificate of ownership for the Miller estate, with a handwritten note from me on the back. I had been carrying it for 3 days, trying to decide the right moment to give it to Chloe. A father's habit, holding on to things until the timing felt right. I set the envelope on the counter beside the wine and looked at both of them for a moment. Then I went to check on the kitchen setup. The catering staff had left their prep notes on the small corkboard beside the refrigerator, a standard practice I had approved when Chloe asked to use the estate's kitchen for the event. I scanned the notes out of habit, the way I always reviewed anything that happened under this roof. That was when I saw it. It was a piece of notepaper, pale yellow, folded once, and tucked behind the prep schedule as if it were part of the same document. My daughter's handwriting, the looping, careful cursive I had watched her develop through 8 years of private school, the same hand I had guided around a pencil when she was 4 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in our first apartment. I unfolded it. The note was addressed to the lead server. It said in full, "The older gentleman in the striped shirt is family, but please keep him away from the VIP guest area and the main floor during the reception. If he lingers, redirect him politely toward the back patio or the kitchen. We want the event to feel seamless." I read it twice. Then I folded it along its original crease and placed it in my jacket pocket next to the envelope. For a long moment, I stood at the kitchen counter, with my hands flat on the cold marble surface, and looked at the pale rectangle of light coming through the window above the sink. Outside, a bird was moving through the oak trees, and I could hear it, but not see it. I had known in the way a man knows things, he has not yet allowed himself to say out loud that something was wrong. Raymond had told me about Chloe's visit to his office months ago. The questions she had asked about the title, the way she had smiled when she asked them, like it was a simple procedural matter, like she was asking about a cable bill. Raymond had called me that same evening, and I had listened without saying much and told him I needed some time to think. What I had not expected was the handwriting on the yellow notepaper. What I had not expected was to feel it in my chest the way I did, like something structural shifting in a building that had been standing a long time. I picked up my thermos and poured a cup of coffee. It had gone slightly cold, but I drank it anyway. Then I picked up the Chateau Margaux from the counter, carried it carefully to the main hall, and set it on the table nearest the bar station where it could breathe. After that, I went back to straightening the tables. A father's habit is hard to break, even when his heart already knows the morning has changed. The catering crew arrived at 8 sharp, the way I had asked them to, and by 10 o'clock, the Miller estate had transformed itself the way old houses do, when people fill them up all at once and almost completely. Flowers had appeared on every surface. White roses and something pale green, I did not know the name of, arranged in tall glass vases that caught the light and threw small rainbows across the ceiling. The quartet had set up near the south window and was running through their warm-up soft and unhurried, the kind of music that was designed to make people feel like they had arrived somewhere that mattered. The smell of the kitchen had spread through the ground floor, butter and herbs, and something sweet underneath, and the first guests were beginning to filter through the front entrance in their good clothes and their good moods. I stayed near the back of the main hall. I had changed into my suit in the small bathroom off the kitchen, the one the catering staff used. It was a dark navy suit, single-breasted with a white shirt and a tie Diana had given me for our 25th anniversary. She had picked it out herself at a shop in Boston, a narrow burgundy stripe on a field of deep blue, and she had held it up against my chest in the store and said, "This one. This is the one that makes you look like you know something nobody else does." I had worn it to her funeral. I had not worn it since. That morning, standing in front of the mirror in my apartment, I had taken it out of the garment bag and held it for a long time before putting it on. I was not entirely sure why I chose it for today. Maybe because it was the last thing she had given me that still held its shape. The guests arrived in waves. First the ones who came early, because they were anxious. Then the ones who came on time because they were organized. Then the ones who were 15 minutes late because they wanted to be seen arriving. I watched them from my position near the marble column, at the far end of the room, hands in my pockets, coffee long since finished. I recognized some faces. Business associates of Robert Vance, the kind of men who wore their wealth in the cut of their jacket, rather than the label. Women from Chloe's university years laughing too loud at something one of them had said near the bar. A city councilman I had dealt with twice in the past decade, who did not recognize me out of context, which was fine. I was good at being out of context. Arthur. The voice came from my left, low and warm, and I turned to find Helen Marsh making her way toward me through the crowd. She was 73 years old and moved like a woman who had decided somewhere in her 60s that she was done apologizing for taking up space. She wore a deep green dress and the same pearl earrings she had worn to Diana's funeral 12 years ago, and when she reached me, she took both my hands in hers and held them. "You look thin," she said. "You say that every time you see me." "Because every time I see you, you look thin." She studied my face the way only old friends are allowed to. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Helen." She made a sound that was not quite agreement. Diana would have been beside herself today. She always said this house needed more noise in it. Diana said a lot of things about this house. She was right about most of them. Helen released my hands, but stayed close, turning to survey the room with me. "The flowers are beautiful. Did Chloe choose them?" "I assume so. I wasn't consulted on the flowers." Helen glanced at me sideways. She had known me long enough to hear what was underneath the sentence. She did not say anything, which was one of the things I had always valued about her. Across the room near the entrance to the east corridor, I noticed Robert Vance for the first time. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with silver hair that had been recently cut, and a suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. He was standing with his wife Evelyn and two men I did not recognize, and he was doing what men like Robert Vance always did at events like this, performing confidence. The particular posture of a man who needed everyone in the room to believe he belonged at the center of it. Then he turned, and his eyes found me across the crowd. I watched his face change. It was subtle, the kind of shift that most people would have missed entirely. A slight tightening around the jaw, a blink that lasted half a second too long, the color in his neck going the wrong direction. He knew exactly who I was. I could see it moving through him like cold water, and I could see him making the decision in real time to pretend he did not. He turned back to his companions and laughed at something one of them said. I filed that away. Evelyn Vance noticed me approximately 4 minutes later. I know the timing because I had just checked my watch when I heard her voice carry across the 10 feet of space between us, pitched precisely at the volume women use when they want to be overheard, without appearing to address anyone directly. "I don't know why they insist on using outside vendors for these things," she was saying to the woman beside her, a blonde in a cream blazer, who nodded along with the enthusiasm of someone being paid to agree. "You end up with people who simply don't understand the environment. Look at the bar setup. Those glasses are completely wrong for sparkling wine. And the staff?" A small, practiced pause. "Well, some of them are trying their best, I'm sure." Her eyes moved to me as she said it. Not quite landing, not quite looking away. The kind of glance that was designed to land and designed to have an exit strategy. I did not react. I had spent 40 years in rooms with people like Evelyn Vance, and I had learned early that reacting was exactly what they were after. The reaction was the point. Without it, they were just a woman in expensive shoes talking to herself. Helen beside me had gone very still. "Don't," I said quietly. "I wasn't going to do anything," she said. Her voice was even, but her jaw was tight. "You were absolutely going to do something," she exhaled. She's been like that since Julian was 12 years old, and she decided he was better than everyone in any room he walked into. Most mothers think that. Most mothers are wrong in a kinder way. I almost smiled at that. Almost. The room was filling now, 200 people finding their rhythms, the noise level climbing to that particular pitch of a party that had decided it was going to be a success, regardless of what anyone actually felt. The quartet had moved into something I recognized, a piece Diana had loved, and hearing it here in this room on this afternoon did something to the space behind my sternum that I did not have a name for. I shifted my weight and looked toward the entrance. Chloe had not come to find me. She had been in the room for 20 minutes. I had seen her the moment she appeared at the top of the staircase in her pale gold dress, laughing at something Julian said into her ear. And in those 20 minutes, she had greeted 11 people by name, accepted 2 glasses of champagne, and looked in my direction exactly once. Once. And when her eyes found me standing at the far end of the room in the suit her mother had chosen. What crossed her face was not relief that I was there, not the particular softening a daughter's face does when she sees her father across a crowded room. She looked at me the way you look through a window. Not at it. Through it at something on the other side. Then she turned back to Julian, and she was smiling again. Helen's hand found my arm. She did not squeeze it. She just left it there, steady and warm, the way you hold a door open for someone without making a production of it. I breathed in slowly and looked back at the room. There was still a long afternoon ahead of us. Julian Vance entered a room the way certain men do when they have practiced it. Shoulders back, chin lifted, just enough to suggest he was looking at the horizon rather than at the people around him. A smile that arrived slightly before the rest of his face caught up to it. He was 34 years old, lean in the way that comes from a gym membership rather than physical work, with dark hair cut close at the sides and a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit men who have never had to think about the price. He moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who believed genuinely and without much examination that every room he walked into had been waiting for him to arrive. I watched him from my position near the column and felt something I could not quite call dislike. Dislike was too simple. What I felt was closer to recognition, the particular recognition of a man who has spent his life building things, watching another man who has spent his life standing next to things that were already built. "That's the groom," Helen said beside me unnecessarily. "I know who he is. I'm just saying." Julian had stopped near the center of the room, where a small cluster of guests had naturally arranged itself around him. He was speaking with his hands, the way men do when they want to suggest that what they are saying is too large to be contained by words alone. I caught fragments across the noise of the room. Actually found this place about 8 months ago, right when we started talking seriously about the engagement. Knew, the moment I walked through the front door, this is it. This is exactly the kind of space that took some doing to make it work, but when you know what you want. He paused to accept a glass of champagne from a passing server, and in the pause he laughed at something one of the men said, and the laugh was easy and full and completely convincing. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm slowly until I felt the edge of it. He was telling them he had found this house, that it had been his decision, his effort, his vision. He was telling them this in the house my grandfather had built in 1948, on land my father had paid off over 30 years of careful work, standing on floors my own hands had refinished twice. He was telling a story in which he was the main character of a house that had never heard his name until 8 months ago, and every person listening to him believed it. I thought about the evening Raymond had called me. It had been a Tuesday late, and I had been sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of water and the day's mail when my phone rang. Raymond's voice was careful in the way it got when he had something to tell me that he knew I would not enjoy hearing. He had explained what Chloe had asked, the questions about title transfer, the language she had used efficient transactional, the language of someone who had thought it through beforehand. He had declined to assist, he said, and he wanted me to know immediately. I had thanked him and set the phone down and sat very still for several minutes. Then I had called Raymond back and asked him to prepare the residency agreement, a formal document granting Chloe and Julian the right to use the Miller estate for the engagement event, contingent on a single condition that the property owner, meaning me, was to be treated with basic dignity by all parties present. Any violation of that condition that would constitute a breach of the agreement and trigger my right to immediate revocation of access. Raymond had drafted it in 2 days. Chloe had signed it without reading past the first paragraph, which did not surprise me. What the agreement meant in plain terms was this: the moment anyone under that roof raised a hand or a voice against me, the house reverted to my sole control without negotiation, without delay, and without appeal. I had not told Chloe what the clause meant. I had simply handed her a pen. Across the room, Julian had moved to the next cluster of guests and was delivering a variation of the same performance. Near the far wall, I noticed a man I did not recognize who was not performing anything at all. He was perhaps 35 in a plain dark jacket holding a glass he had not touched, and he was watching Julian with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was not there to enjoy the party. He caught me looking and gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged without explaining. I filed him away too. "Who is that?" Helen asked, following my line of sight. "I don't know yet," I said. She made a small sound. "He looks like someone taking notes." "People who take notes are usually either accountants or journalists," I said. "He doesn't look like an accountant." Helen sipped her water. "Should that concern you?" I considered the question honestly. Julian was still talking. Chloe had crossed the room to join him, slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow, with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to make herself smaller, to fit beside someone. She was laughing at something, her head tilted toward his shoulder, and from this distance she looked exactly like the girl in the photographs on my mantel. At home, open-faced, bright-eyed, full of forward momentum. She did not look like herself. She looked like a performance of herself. "No," I said, finally answering Helen's question. "It doesn't concern me." I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the edge of the envelope with 2 fingers. The certificate of ownership. The document I had been carrying for 3 days. I had imagined in a loose and unexamined way that I would find a moment before the formal proceedings to take Chloe aside and press it into her hands. A father's gesture, a passing of the torch. I let go of the envelope and withdrew my hand from my pocket. He was performing for a room full of people who believed his version of the story. I was the only one in that room who knew the original. And sometimes I had learned the most powerful thing a man can do is stand quietly in possession of the truth and wait for the moment it becomes necessary. That moment I knew was coming. I just did not yet know what shape it would take when it arrived. I found my way to the side garden sometime around 2 in the afternoon, through the narrow door off the east hallway that most guests would not think to try. It opened onto a stone path that ran alongside the house, bordered on one side by a low hedge Diana had planted from cuttings she brought back from her mother's yard in Vermont, and on the other side by a stretch of open lawn that rolled gently down toward the tree line. Nobody was out here. The party sound softened as the door closed behind me, dropping to something muffled and distant, like music playing in another house. I stood on the stone path and breathed. The air was cold, the way November air in New England gets cold not aggressively, but with a kind of settled intention, the kind that reminds you that the season has made up its mind. The oak trees along the driveway had gone mostly bare, their branches dark against a sky that could not decide between gray and blue. Somewhere in the middle distance, a cardinal was making itself heard, bright and insistent the way cardinals always are. Diana had loved cardinals. She said they were the only bird with enough self-respect to stay red all winter. I sat down on the stone bench at the garden's edge, the one we had brought back from a salvage yard in Connecticut on a Saturday 20 years ago, loaded into the back of a borrowed truck, Diana laughing the whole drive home because we had no idea how we were going to unload it. We had figured it out the way we always figured things out. Together and imperfectly, and without asking anyone for help. I reached into my jacket and took out the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, the way important things sometimes are. Inside was the certificate of ownership for the Miller estate, transferred fully and irrevocably into my name following my father's death 14 months ago. Below the certificate, folded separately, was a handwritten letter, 2 pages front and back in my own handwriting, addressed to Chloe. I had started writing it the night my father's attorney called to confirm the transfer. I had sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, drafting and crossing out, and starting again, trying to find the words for something that did not have a clean shape. What I finally wrote was not a legal document, and not a farewell, and not an explanation. It was closer to a record. The things I had done, the reasons I had done them, the things I hoped she understood, and the things I suspected she did not. I had written about Diana. Specifically, I had written about the last real conversation Diana and I had 3 weeks before she died, when she was still clear-headed enough to be herself. She had been sitting up in the hospital bed, with the afternoon light coming through the window at a low angle, and she had reached over and taken my hand without preamble and said, "Promise me something." I had said anything. She had looked at me with the directness she had always had, the quality I had fallen in love with first before anything else. "Promise me you'll keep showing up for her," she said. "Even when she makes it hard. Even when she forgets to show up for you. You're the steady one, Arthur. You've always been the steady one. Don't stop being that because I'm not here to remind you." I had promised. I had kept that promise for 12 years. The envelope in my hands had been my way of honoring it one final time, a gift large enough to mean something, offered freely, without conditions. The estate. The letter. Everything I had not said in all the years of saying nothing, because saying it would have required her to listen. A photographer appeared at the garden door. He was young, maybe 25, with a camera bag over one shoulder, and the distracted energy of someone running a checklist in his head. He pushed the door open, scanned the garden, and then looked at me the way people look at an object they need to move. "Sorry, sir," he said, not unkindly. "We're going to need to use this space for some of the formal shots in about 20 minutes. Would you mind?" He gestured vaguely toward the inside of the house. "Of course," I said. I stood and straightened my jacket. He was already looking at his checklist again. I had taken 3 steps back toward the door when I heard Helen's voice behind me. "Arthur." She had followed me out. Or perhaps she had simply known where I would go. With Helen, it was sometimes hard to tell. She was standing just outside the door, her green dress dark against the pale stone of the house, and she was looking at me with an expression I recognized from the weeks after Diana died. Not pity, which I could not have tolerated, but something more like bearing witness. The face of a person who is choosing not to look away. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I saw the photographs." I looked at her. "On the table in the front hall," she said quietly. "The ones the photographer printed as test shots. You weren't in any of them." She paused. "Not a single one, Arthur." The cardinal in the oak trees called out again, sharp and clear. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. I turned it over once. The paper had gone slightly soft at the corners from being handled so many times over the past 3 days, pressed and released and pressed again by a man who kept deciding he was not ready to let it go. Diana had said to keep showing up. She had not said anything about what to do when showing up was no longer enough. I slid the envelope back into my inside pocket and felt it settle against my chest, over my heart, the way it had been sitting all morning. Then I looked at Helen and gave her the most honest answer I had. "I know," I said. She held the garden door open for me without a word. Diana always said love means showing up anyway. I had shown up. What happened next was no longer in my hands. Before I reveal the shocking confrontation that changed everything, let me know you're locked in. Comment the word "still here" right now so I know you're following this journey to the end. And please note, the upcoming events contain some fictional elements added for dramatic effect. If this style of storytelling isn't what you're looking for, you may turn off the video right here. The host tapped the microphone at 2:30, and the room gathered itself the way rooms do when someone with a schedule makes a sound. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Glasses were set down, bodies turned toward the small, raised platform near the north windows, where the formal proceedings were about to begin. I came back inside through the east hallway door and found a position near the bar station, close enough to see everything, far enough from the center that nobody would think to look at me. The Chateau Margaux was still on the table where I had placed it that morning, its shoulders dark and patient. I had intended it as a gift. I had not yet decided what it was now. Julian was already moving through the crowd toward the platform, accepting congratulations with the practiced grace of a man who expected them. Chloe was beside him, her hand in his, her smile doing the work her eyes were not quite doing. They looked from a distance like exactly what everyone in the room wanted them to be. The host said something about the happy couple. Applause moved through the room like a small wave. I picked up a tray from the bar station. One of the catering staff had set it down to adjust something behind the counter and had not come back for it, and there were 4 glasses of red wine on it that needed to go to the table nearest the platform. I had been helping with small tasks like this all day without thinking about it. It was habit. It was what you did in a house you had maintained for 40 years. I carried the tray across the floor. I was perhaps 6 feet from Julian when it happened. He turned from the person he was speaking with, stepping backward into the path I was walking, and his elbow caught the edge of the tray. One glass tipped. A small amount of wine, perhaps 2 tablespoons, landed on the lower half of his jacket sleeve. It was an accident. There was no other word for it. Julian looked at his sleeve. Then he looked at me. Something crossed his face that I recognized not from personal experience, but from years of watching it happen to other people, the particular expression of a man who has found a target and decided in the span of a single second that the target will not fight back. "What is wrong with you?" His voice was not loud yet, but it was heading there. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs?" "I apologize," I said. "It was an accident. An accident." He said the word the way people repeat words they find inadequate. He looked around at the nearest guests, pulling them in as witnesses, as audience. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he said to no one in particular and everyone in general. "You hire outside help, you get outside results." My chest tightened. I kept my face still. "Julian," Chloe's voice came from somewhere behind him, uncertain. He ignored her. He reached past me and lifted the Chateau Margaux from the table, my bottle, the one I had carried up from the cellar that morning, with both hands, and he held it up with the casual authority of a man handling something that belonged to him. "You know what?" he said, his voice rising, now finding its performance register. "Let me show you what it feels like." He tipped the bottle. The wine came out fast and dark, hitting my left shoulder first, then spreading across the front of my jacket, in a wash of deep red that soaked through to the shirt beneath in the space of 3 seconds. It ran down the collar Diana had pressed flat with her hands 25 years ago in a hotel in Boston the morning of our anniversary dinner. It spread across the lapel she had smoothed with 2 fingers the last time I wore this suit standing in a church in November burying her. Somewhere to my right, I heard Evelyn Vance make a small noise that was not quite a gasp and not quite a laugh, something in between, something that came from a person who was both surprised and deeply satisfied. I did not look at her. I had heard there was a phone pointed in our direction, but I did not confirm it. What I felt was not rage. That surprised me even in the moment. What I felt was something much quieter and much more final. A door closing somewhere deep in the architecture of who I was. Swinging shut on a hinge I had not known was loose until now. The wine dripped from my jacket cuff onto the hardwood floor Diana and I had refinished together in the summer of 2003, down on our hands and knees, with Sanders and Stain laughing, because neither of us knew what we were doing. Dominic Reyes appeared in the kitchen doorway across the room. He was a broad-shouldered man of 50 with flour still on his left forearm, and he was looking at me with the expression of a man who had a father and knew what he was looking at. He did not move. He did not need to. He just stood there and watched, and his watching was its own kind of testimony. Julian straightened his cuffs. "Clean yourself up," he said, "and next time watch where you're going." She moved through the crowd toward me, and for 3 full seconds I let myself believe it. That is the thing nobody tells you about being a parent, that the hope does not die on schedule. That even after the photographs with no faces in them, even after the yellow notepad in the kitchen, even after 12 years of learning to read the distance in her eyes, some part of you will still look up when your child walks toward you and think, this is the moment. This is where it turns. Chloe crossed the floor in her pale gold dress, her heels making no sound on the hardwood, and she stopped 2 feet in front of me with her hands clasped in front of her waist. Her face was arranged very carefully. I had watched her learn to arrange her face from the time she was a teenager, the particular skill of showing exactly what a situation required and nothing more. She had gotten very good at it. "Dad." Her voice was low, measured, designed to carry only to me. "You need to go." The word landed the way quiet words sometimes land harder than loud ones. "Chloe, don't." Her jaw tightened. "Don't make this into something. Just go out through the kitchen, call a car, and go home. I'll call you tomorrow." Behind her, Julian was accepting a fresh glass of something from a server, performing the looseness of a man who had already moved on. Several guests had shifted back into conversation, but were watching us from the edges of their peripheral vision, the way people watch accidents close enough to see far enough to claim they weren't looking. "I'm not going to make a scene," I said. "You already are one." Her voice cracked on the last word, but not with grief, with the particular frustration of a woman whose carefully managed afternoon was not going the way she had planned it. "Please, Dad, just—" She stopped, recalibrated, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something I had never heard from her before, something that had Julian's cadence underneath it, his rhythm, his dismissiveness wearing her vocal cords like a coat. "Julian's family is watching. His colleagues are watching. I cannot have this right now." "This," I said. "You mean me?" She did not answer that. Julian appeared at her shoulder. He set his hand on the small of her back, with the casual ownership of a man remapping territory, and he looked at me the way men look at problems they expect other people to solve. "I think your father needs some direction," he said to Chloe pleasantly, the way you say something unpleasant, in a pleasant tone because the audience is still watching. Chloe's shoulders straightened. Something shifted in her face, the last negotiating part of her giving way to whatever she had decided before she walked over here. She looked at me with eyes that had gone flat and certain, and she said it. Apologize to Julian, Dad. Get down and apologize and then go home. The room was not silent. The music was still playing. Two conversations were still happening somewhere behind me. But every person within 10 feet had gone very still, holding their drinks without drinking, watching without watching. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the eyes I had watched open for the first time in a hospital room in Burlington, Vermont, on a Tuesday morning in April, while Diana squeezed my hand hard enough to leave marks. I looked at the face I had memorized over 31 years, the curve of her jaw that was Diana's, the set of her chin that was mine. I looked for the girl who had fallen asleep on my chest during thunderstorms until she was 9 years old, her small fist wrapped in the fabric of my shirt, trusting completely that I would hold the storm off. She was not there. I did not say anything for a long moment. Then I straightened the lapel of my jacket, the one still wet with wine, the one Diana had last touched with 2 fingers, slowly, the way you finish something. No, I said. Chloe's breath came in sharp. Dad, no, I said again, not louder, just clearer. Julian's expression shifted. He had expected something else, and the fact that he had not gotten it moved through him visibly, a recalculation running behind his eyes. I turned and walked toward the exit. Dominic Reyes was still in the kitchen doorway. As I passed him, he stepped aside and held the door open with one hand, his eyes on the floor, and I understood that was his way of giving me what dignity the moment had left to give. I did not look back, but I heard her. Behind me, carrying over the soft music and the resumed conversations and the particular noise of 200 people deciding not to acknowledge what they had just witnessed, I heard Chloe's voice say to the room or to Julian or to herself. I could not be certain which. Good. We didn't need him here anyway. The kitchen door swung shut. I had walked out of harder rooms than this one. I had walked out of boardrooms and courtrooms and hospital rooms with nothing left in them that I wanted to stay for. But I had never walked out of a room where my daughter was the one holding the door. The kitchen smelled like butter and rosemary, and the particular warmth of a room that has been working hard all afternoon, and I walked through it without stopping. Dominic's crew parted around me without a word. 3 people in white jackets who kept their eyes on their work, the way professionals do when they have witnessed something they were not supposed to witness, and have decided collectively to offer a man the dignity of pretending they did not. I appreciated it more than I could have explained. I did not try. The service corridor beyond the kitchen ran the length of the house's east side, narrow and plain, with a linoleum floor and fluorescent lighting that had always bothered Diana because it made the walls look the color of old paper. She had asked my father twice to have it replaced. He had agreed twice and never gotten around to it. Some things outlast the intentions we have for them. I walked its full length and pushed out through the heavy door at the end into the side yard. The cold hit me immediately, the way November cold does when you have been in a heated room too long, total, and clarifying like a hand flat against your chest. The wine on my jacket had gone from warm to cool somewhere in the kitchen, and was cold now, stiffening slightly in the air, and I could feel the shape of it against my skin, the outline of what had happened pressed into the fabric. I did not look back at the house. I had made that decision somewhere in the corridor without exactly deciding it. Looking back was for men who were not yet sure. I was sure. The gravel driveway crunched under my shoes, steady and even. The oak trees Diana had planted were dark columns on either side of me, and the late afternoon light was doing what late afternoon light does in November. In New England, going gold at the edges, then fading fast. The sky pressing down toward the tree line with the unhurried certainty of a season that knows it has already won. I reached into my jacket pocket. Not the inside pocket where the envelope was. The outer left pocket where I kept my phone. It was ringing before I had finished pulling it out. The screen read Tommy Callahan, and I answered because Tommy did not call without reason. Mr. Miller. His voice was 24 years old, and trying to sound older the way it always was when he had something important to deliver. I just heard from Mr. Harris. He said to tell you the paperwork is ready on his end. All of it. He said you'd know what that means. I do, I said. He also said, a pause, the kind where a young man is deciding whether to say the next thing. He said to tell you he's sorry. About today. He didn't say how he knew, but he said it. Raymond knew because Raymond always knew. He had been my father's attorney before he was mine, and he had a particular talent for understanding situations from a distance, reading the shape of things through paperwork and phone calls, the way a doctor reads an X-ray, not the surface but the structure underneath. Tell him I'll call him in 5 minutes, I said. I ended the call and kept walking. The driveway was long, 300 yards from the house to the gate, and I had always liked that about it. My father had said a long driveway gave a man time to change his mind before he arrived somewhere, and time to make peace with his decision before he left. I had thought about that a lot over the years. I was thinking about it now. I passed the place where Diana and I had once stood in the rain, arguing about something I could no longer remember until she started laughing, because a frog had appeared on the gravel between us and was sitting there looking at us both with what she described as professional disappointment. We had laughed until we were leaning on each other, the argument gone, entirely replaced by something better. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm. Then I stopped walking and called Raymond. He answered on the first ring. Arthur. It's time, I said. A pause, not hesitation, just Raymond processing the way he did when he was running sequences in his head. All of it, I said. The access revocation, the ownership confirmation, everything we discussed. Tonight. Understood. Another pause. The clause is solid, Arthur. What happened today, if there's documentation? There's documentation, I said. I thought of Evelyn's phone tilted in my direction. I thought of Dominic in the doorway. I thought of 200 people with devices in their pockets. There's more than enough. Then we move tonight. Raymond's voice had shifted into the register it went to when he was no longer a friend on the phone but a lawyer with a job to do, precise, unhurried, certain. Marcus can be there within the hour. I'll have the notices prepared and served by the time the last guest leaves. Good, I said. Arthur. His voice came back briefly to the other register. You did the right thing, staying as long as you did, giving her the chances you gave her. I looked up at the oak trees, their bare branches making a lattice against the pale sky. Raymond, I said, just get it done. I ended the call and stood at the end of the driveway, one hand on the iron gate, the cold working its way through my jacket and my shirt, and the thing underneath my shirt that had no name, but was the part of a man that registers the difference between a hard day and a day that has changed something permanently. Behind me up the long gravel drive, the lights of the Miller estate burned warm and golden against the darkening sky, the way they had burned on 100 evenings when I had stood at this gate and looked back with something that felt like belonging. 3 words. That was all it took. 40 years of patience compressed into a single phone call, and I had said them without raising my voice. I am going to tell you what happened in Raymond Harris's office that evening, the way he told it to me afterward, sitting across from me at his desk with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, because I was not there and I will not pretend I was. But I need you to understand something first. Raymond Harris had been my father's attorney before he was mine. He had drafted the original deed for the Miller estate in 1971, sitting at the same oak desk he still used in the same building on Chestnut Street in Hartford that had his father's name on the door before it had his. He had written my parents' wills, negotiated my father's business contracts, and attended Diana's funeral in a dark suit with a white pocket square standing in the back row without being asked, because he understood that some things you show up for regardless of whether you were invited. He was 68 years old, and he had spent 40 of those years watching what happened to families when money and property and grief got tangled together, and he had developed over those decades a particular quality that I had always valued in him above everything else. He was not surprised by people. He had heard worse. He had seen worse. And when something was bad enough to register on Raymond Harris's face, you knew without question that it was genuinely bad. When my call came through at 3:14 that afternoon, Raymond was already at his desk. Tommy Callahan was at the small table by the window, working through the last section of the residency agreement. Documentation, cross-referencing, the ownership transfer records my father's estate had filed 14 months ago. They had been ready for this in the way that careful men are ready for things they hope will not be necessary. Raymond set the phone down after our call and looked at Tommy for a moment. "Get Marcus on the line," he said. "Tell him we need him at the Miller estate by 5 o'clock. Full team." Tommy reached for his phone without asking questions. That was one of the things Raymond valued about him. The young man understood that certain moments called for action first and understanding later. While Tommy made the call, Raymond opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a manila folder he had prepared 3 weeks ago after Chloe had come to his office, asking questions about title transfer. Inside the folder were 4 documents. The first was the certificate of ownership for the Miller estate bearing Arthur Miller's name and the official seal of Hartford County. The second was the residency agreement Chloe had signed page 1, initialed pages 2 through 6, unsigned and unread, with the breach clause highlighted in yellow on page 3. The clause stated clearly in language Raymond had chosen with precision that any act of physical aggression, deliberate humiliation, or hostile conduct directed at the property owner by any guest family member or invited party during the event period would constitute an immediate and irrevocable breach of the access license, returning full and sole control of the property to Arthur Miller without notice, negotiation, or delay. The third document was the mortgage guarantee agreement Raymond had filed on behalf of Miller Holdings 18 months ago, under which Arthur had agreed to serve as guarantor for a $2.4 million business loan taken out by Vance Family Enterprises. The agreement contained a cross-default clause standard language in commercial guarantees, which meant that any material breach of a related agreement could trigger acceleration of the loan, making the full balance immediately due. Raymond had flagged this clause the day he filed it. He had said nothing about it to Arthur because Arthur had not asked, and Raymond had learned long ago that the best lawyers tell their clients what they need to know when they need to know it, and not one moment before. The fourth document was a printout. Tommy had pulled it from his phone 20 minutes before Arthur's call came through a video clip 47 seconds long, already circulating on 3 different platforms, posted from an account belonging to one Evelyn Vance. The clip showed with remarkable clarity Julian Vance tipping a wine bottle over the head of an older man in a dark suit. The caption read, "My son not taking any nonsense from the help. That's how we raised him." Raymond had watched it once. Then he had printed the transcript of the caption and added it to the folder. When Marcus called back, his voice was the voice of a man who had spent 20 years in private security and had long since stopped being surprised by the things families did to each other in nice houses. "What are we looking at?" Marcus asked. "Property access revocation," Raymond said. "Standard execution. 4 individuals on site, possibly more, by the time you arrive. The property owner has already departed. You'll be meeting the current occupants at the gate. Any resistance expected?" He thought about Chloe's signature on the first page of an agreement she had not read. "Verbal, probably." Raymond said. "Nothing beyond that. Bring the full documentation package. They'll want to see paper." "We'll be there by 5. "Make it 4:45, Raymond said. "I want to be set up before the last guests leave." He closed the folder and set it at the center of his desk, squared to the edges the way his father had taught him to square documents, as a sign of respect for what was inside them. Then he picked up his coffee, found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway. Tommy looked up from the window table. He was 24 years old, the son of a woman who had cleaned offices in this building for 11 years. A young man who had gotten through law school on a scholarship. Arthur Miller had funded without ever putting his name on it. His eyes were steady and serious, in the way of someone who understood, without needing it, explained that the thing they were doing tonight mattered beyond the paperwork. "Is there anything else?" Tommy asked. Raymond looked at the folder on his desk. Then he looked at the window where the afternoon had gone dark, in the way November afternoons do all at once without warning, as if the light had simply decided it was done. "Inside the ballroom," Raymond said quietly, to no one in particular. "They're still toasting." Tommy did not answer. He went back to his work. "I was not in the room when the last hour of the party played out, but I know what happened in it." Helen told me some of it 3 days later over the phone, her voice careful and precise the way it gets when she is choosing words rather than just saying them. Kevin Park filled in the rest months afterward, when the story he had been building finally ran, and he called to tell me it was going live and to ask if I had anything to add. I did not have anything to add. But I listened. What they described was this. After I walked out through the kitchen, the room did what rooms full of people do when something uncomfortable has happened in them. It rearranged itself. Conversations restarted. Glasses were refilled. The quartet, after a pause of perhaps 90 seconds, that Helen described as the longest 90 seconds she had sat through in recent memory, resumed playing. The party decided collectively, and without discussion, to continue. Julian made that easy for them. He reappeared in the center of the room within 4 minutes of my departure. His jacket changed. He had gone upstairs and come back in a fresh one. A lighter gray, and the speed of the change told Helen everything she needed to know about how prepared he had been for exactly this kind of situation. He moved through the remaining guests with his hand extended, his laugh ready, his shoulders back, and he performed the role of unbothered host, with a commitment that Helen said was in its own way impressive. "He really believed it," she told me. "That's the thing, Arthur. He wasn't pretending to be fine. He actually was fine. He thought it was over." Chloe stayed close to his side. She had touched up her makeup. Helen noticed the slight difference in her lipstick from earlier, and she smiled at the right moments and accepted congratulations with both hands wrapped around her champagne glass. And if her eyes were slightly too bright, and her laugh came a half-second too late, only the people who knew her well enough to look for it would have seen. Helen was one of those people. She sat at her table near the east window and watched and did not say much to anyone, which was unusual for her, and which she said later made her feel like a person waiting at a train station for a train they were not certain was coming. Robert Vance was not fine. Robert had been off his rhythm since the moment I had walked in the front door. But after I left, something shifted in him that went beyond discomfort. He kept his phone out, checking it with the frequency of a man expecting news he did not want to receive. His wife, Evelyn, had drifted into a cluster of women near the bar and was telling a story that made them laugh, apparently unconcerned, apparently untouched by what had happened. But Robert stood slightly apart from the nearest group, his champagne glass full, and going warm in his hand, his eyes moving to the front entrance every few minutes. Helen noticed. Kevin Park noticed too. He was 36 years old, with the particular stillness of a journalist who has learned that the best thing you can do at an event is look like you belong there and say very little. He had watched everything. He had watched Julian tip the bottle. He had watched Chloe cross the room. He had watched Arthur walk out through the kitchen door without looking back, and he had noted in the small leather notebook he kept in his jacket pocket the precise time and a 3-word description: quiet, complete, final. Now he stood near the fireplace with a glass of water and watched Robert Vance check his phone for the 11th time. At 4:23, Robert's phone buzzed with something that made him go very still. He read whatever it was twice. Then he looked up and scanned the room with the expression of a man who has just understood something he wishes he had understood much earlier, and who is calculating in real time whether there is anything left to do about it. There was not. But Kevin did not know that yet. Julian was in the middle of a story about a golf trip to Scotland when Robert appeared at his elbow and said something low and urgent into his ear. Julian's story stopped mid-sentence. His expression did not collapse. It held for 2 or 3 seconds longer than it should have, the way a building holds, for a moment after the foundation goes, and then something in the set of his jaw shifted, and he said quietly to the man he had been telling the story to, "Excuse me for just a minute." Chloe saw it. Helen watched her see it, the slight drop in Chloe's shoulders, the way her hand tightened around the stem of her glass, until her knuckles went pale. She knew something was wrong, Helen told me. Not what, but something. Outside, the first set of headlights came up the long gravel driveway. Helen stood up from her table unhurried and lifted her coat from the back of her chair. She said goodbye to the 2 women nearest her, shook hands with a man she had known for 30 years, and made her way toward the front entrance at the measured pace of a woman who had decided it was time to leave and saw no reason to rush. At the door, she paused and looked back at the room. Julian and Robert were standing close together near the east corridor, their voices low and tight. Chloe was still holding her champagne perfectly still, watching her fiancé's face. The quartet played on. Helen put on her coat and stepped outside. They were so busy performing happiness that none of them had noticed the lights in the driveway. Marcus told me later that he had timed their arrival deliberately, not so early that the remaining guests would still be thick on the grounds, where a crowd could complicate things. Not so late that Julian and Chloe would have retreated inside and locked what they still believed were their doors. The window Marcus was looking for was the one that opened in the last 20 minutes of a party, when the caterers are breaking down and the guests who are leaving are already halfway to their cars, and the ones who are staying are saying their last goodbyes near the entrance. That was the window. He hit it exactly. There were 3 vehicles. Marcus drove the first one himself, a dark gray SUV with Raymond in the passenger seat, and Tommy Callahan in the back with the documentation folder on his knees. Behind them came 2 more vehicles carrying the security team, 4 men total, all of them former law enforcement, all of them in plain dark jackets that said nothing and implied everything. They came up the gravel driveway at a steady pace, headlights on in the early dark, and parked in a line at the base of the front steps. Raymond said Julian and Chloe were standing at the top of the steps with Robert and Evelyn when they pulled up. The 4 of them had just finished walking a cluster of guests to their cars and were in the middle of a conversation that looked from a distance like it was about logistics, next weekend dinner, a follow-up call. The ordinary language of people wrapping up an event they believed had gone well. Then they saw the vehicles. Julian's posture changed first. Raymond said it was subtle, a slight stiffening through the shoulders, a reordering of how he was standing, the physical adjustment of a man who has spotted something he does not recognize and is deciding, before he has any information, how to be bigger than it. Robert recognized Raymond before Raymond had fully stepped out of the SUV. Raymond told me Robert's face did something complicated in that moment. A rapid sequence of expressions that moved through surprise and recognition and calculation, and something that might have been relief, and something that was definitely not all in the space of about 2 seconds. Robert Vance had known Raymond Harris for 22 years. He had known him as his ex-wife's brother, then as his family's occasional legal adversary in a property dispute in 2009, and he had known, with the particular knowledge of a man who has spent his career in business, that Raymond Harris showing up somewhere unannounced was not a thing that happened without significance. He said nothing. He put his hand on Evelyn's arm and took a small step backward. Julian came down the steps. He came down them with the energy of a man who has decided that whatever this is, he is going to be the one who controls it. And Raymond said he almost admired the commitment of it, the sheer performance of a man walking towards something he did not understand, with his chin up and his hands loose at his sides. "Can I help you?" Julian said. His tone was the tone of a property owner addressing an unexpected visitor, pleasant on the surface, with authority underneath it, the voice of a man who was used to being the one who decided when conversations began and ended. Raymond introduced himself by full name and title. He presented his bar card, a reflex from 30 years of practice, the professional courtesy of a man who understood that the first thing you established in any legal situation was exactly who you were. "I'm here on behalf of Arthur Miller," Raymond said, "the owner of this property. I have documents to present to the current occupants." Julian stared at him. "The owner," he said with the careful emphasis of a man repeating a word he found absurd. "Yes," Raymond said. He did not elaborate. He had learned decades ago that in moments like this, the less you said, the more the silence worked for you. "I think there's been some confusion," Julian said. He produced a smile from somewhere, the reflexive social tool of a man reaching for the thing that had always worked before. "This property was arranged through our family's real estate team. I'm not sure what Mr. Miller's involvement is, but I'm certain we can sort this out with a phone call on Monday." "There won't be a phone call on Monday," Raymond said. He nodded to Tommy, who opened the folder and extracted the first document. The breach notification, 2 pages printed on Harris & Associates letterhead, citing the specific clause, the specific violation, and the specific time at which the violation had occurred. Raymond held it out toward Julian with 2 fingers, the way you hand someone something you expect them to read carefully. Julian did not take it immediately. For a moment, he stood at the base of his own borrowed steps, the November dark pressing in around the circle of light from the entrance, and his smile held a beat too long, the last moment before something that has been holding finally does not. Chloe appeared at the top of the steps. She had her arms crossed over her chest against the cold, and she looked down at Raymond, at the documents, at the line of vehicles in the driveway, and something moved across her face that was not the careful arrangement she had been maintaining all afternoon. It was rawer than that, younger than that. She looked for just a moment like someone who was beginning to understand that the story she had been telling herself had a different ending than the one she had planned. "Julian," she said, her voice tight. "What is this?" Julian turned to look at her, and Raymond said that in the half-second of that turn, the performance slipped entirely, just for a moment, just long enough to see what was underneath it, which was a man who did not know what this was, and was no longer sure he could make it into something he controlled. He reached out and took the document from Raymond's hand. His smile came apart piece by piece, the way a wall comes apart that has been cracking from the inside for years. "Raymond told me he set the folder on the hood of the SUV, not on a table, not handed across in a formal exchange on the hood of a car in the November dark under the light of the entrance lamps, because that was what the situation called for, and Raymond Harris had long since stopped needing the trappings of a conference room to do his job. He opened it and laid the documents out one at a time, left to right, the way you lay out evidence when you want someone to understand not just the conclusion, but the sequence that led to it. Julian was still holding the breach notification. He had read it twice or pretended to read it twice, Raymond could not be certain which, and his jaw had settled into the particular set of a man who has decided that the correct response to something he does not understand is to treat it as beneath him. "This is a document your client prepared," Julian said. "That doesn't make it legally binding. Anyone can write anything on letterhead." "You're correct," Raymond said pleasantly, "which is why I brought the supporting materials." He placed the first document on the hood. The certificate of ownership for the Miller estate issued by Hartford County, bearing Arthur Miller's name in the top left corner and the county seal in the bottom right. 14 months old. Completely unambiguous. Julian looked at it. His throat moved. "My second document," Raymond said, placing it to the right of the first, "is the residency agreement you signed in August of this year. Specifically, I would direct your attention to page 3, which you did not initial, in which the breach clause appears." He tapped the highlighted paragraph with one finger. "The clause is self-executing. No court action is required to trigger it. The moment the violation occurred, the license terminated. That happened at approximately 2:37 this afternoon." Chloe made a sound that was not quite a word. She had come down the steps and was standing beside Julian, now close enough that their arms were touching, and Raymond said her eyes were moving across the documents with the rapid, slightly unfocused movement of someone trying to read faster than their brain was processing. "The third document," Raymond continued, placing it beside the second, "is a mortgage guarantee agreement filed 18 months ago by Miller Holdings, under which Arthur Miller agreed to serve as financial guarantor for a business loan of $2.4 million taken out by Vance Family Enterprises." He paused to let that land. "The agreement contains a standard cross-default clause. In plain terms, that means a material breach of any related agreement, such as the one that occurred at 2:37 this afternoon, can trigger an acceleration of that loan, making the full balance immediately due and payable." Robert Vance stepped forward for the first time. His voice was not loud. It was the voice of a man who had just watched the architecture of a plan he had spent 2 years building come apart at the load-bearing joint, and who was attempting through sheer force of professional habit to sound like he was still in a meeting he was running. "Raymond," Robert said, "let's talk about this." Raymond looked at him. "Hello, Robert." Something passed between them in that look. 22 years of shared history, compressed into 2 seconds, the particular silence of men who know too much about each other to pretend otherwise. Robert's jaw tightened. He took a step back. Julian's head turned sharply toward his father. "You know him?" Robert did not answer. "Dad." Julian's voice cracked on the word, the first real fracture in the performance. "Do you know this man?" "It's not important right now," Robert said. Which was, Raymond told me later. Perhaps the most dishonest thing Robert Vance had said in a long career of strategic dishonesty. Raymond placed the fourth document on the hood. It was a single printed page, a screenshot of Evelyn's video time-stamped with the caption reproduced below it in full. Beside it, Tommy set down a printed sheet showing the video's current view count across 3 platforms, and below that, a 1-paragraph summary of the legal definition of intentional infliction of emotional distress under Connecticut state law, which Raymond had added that afternoon as what he described to me as a courtesy. Evelyn made a sound that started as an objection and ended as something else entirely when she recognized her own caption in print. Julian pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said. His voice had found a new register, harder, thinner, the voice of a man who has run out of performance and is reaching for the one tool he still believed he had. "You are trespassing on private property, and I am going to have every one of you removed." Raymond nodded. "That is your right." The 2 officers arrived 11 minutes later, which Raymond said was impressively fast for a Friday evening. They came up the driveway in a single cruiser parked behind the line of SUVs and walked up to the group with the measured, unhurried pace of officers who had been dispatched to a property dispute and were expecting paperwork rather than violence. The senior officer looked at Raymond first, then at the documents spread across the hood of the SUV. Raymond handed him the certificate of ownership. The officer read it. He looked up at Julian. He looked back at Raymond. "Sir," he said to Julian with the particular careful neutrality of law enforcement that has assessed a situation and reached a conclusion. "According to this documentation, you do not have a legal right to occupy this property. The owner has revoked your access license. We cannot compel you to leave, but we also cannot compel the owner's representatives to leave, and if you remain on the premises after the access revocation has been formally served, you may be subject to criminal trespass charges." Julian stared at him. "We're the ones who called you," Julian said. "Yes, sir," the officer said. "I understand that." The second officer had stepped back slightly and was looking at the documents with the expression of a man doing quiet arithmetic. He leaned toward his partner and said something low that Raymond did not catch. The senior officer nodded. Chloe's hand found Julian's arm. Her grip was tight enough that Raymond could see the pressure of her fingers from where he stood, and her voice when she spoke was the voice of a woman asking a question she already knew the answer to, but needed to hear out loud anyway. "Where is my father?" she said. Raymond looked at her steadily. "He went home," he said. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes bright and her jaw working. And Raymond said she looked in that moment like someone who had just remembered that they had left something important somewhere and could not for the life of them recall where they had put it. "She'd just remembered I existed," I told Raymond when he got to that part. Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it looked like. Marcus told me he gave them 30 minutes. That was the standard he had established over 20 years of this kind of work, not out of legal obligation, because the access license termination meant he had every right to begin immediately, but out of what he called professional courtesy, which I understood to mean the particular human decency of a man who had seen enough of these situations to know that dignity, even at the end of something, costs nothing to offer. He told Julian and Chloe they had 30 minutes to collect personal belongings. Clothing documents, phones, medication. Anything that was unambiguously theirs and not the property of the estate. One of his team members would accompany each of them through the house to ensure the process was orderly. Julian told Marcus exactly what he could do with 30 minutes. Marcus said he understood and that the offer stood regardless and that the clock had started. Tommy told me later that Julian's response to being given 30 minutes was to spend the first 12 of them standing on the front steps, making phone calls to his personal attorney, who did not answer to a college friend who was also an attorney, and who answered, but said carefully and with evident discomfort that there was not much he could do tonight, and to his father, who was standing 8 feet away and turned his back when the phone rang, which Tommy said was the moment Julian finally understood that his father had known something Julian had not, and had chosen for reasons of his own to say nothing. Evelyn had gone quiet in a way that Tommy described as total, not the quiet of a woman processing, but the quiet of a woman who had looked at the situation from every available angle and concluded that there was nothing left to perform for. She sat on the stone balustrade at the edge of the front steps with her coat pulled tight and her phone in her lap, and stared at the gravel driveway without speaking to anyone. Robert stood beside her and did not touch her and did not speak. Chloe went inside. She went alone, waving off the team member Marcus sent to accompany her, and Marcus let her go because she had asked quietly, and because something in the way she asked it made him decide that whatever she needed to do in those rooms by herself for a few minutes was something she had earned the right to do. He stationed someone at the bottom of the staircase and gave her 10 minutes. Tommy said she came back down in 8. She was carrying a small overnight bag and a framed photograph and nothing else, and her face had the particular quality of someone who has just walked through every room of a place they are leaving and said goodbye to it without telling anyone they were doing it. She set the overnight bag down at the bottom of the steps and stood with the photograph held against her chest, with both arms the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. Marcus approached Julian for the second time. "I need your house keys," he said, "and any access codes you have for the smart lock system." Julian stared at him. His phone calls had not produced help, and the 30 minutes were up, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent an entire day performing had settled into him visibly, in the line of his shoulders, in the way he was holding his jaw, in the flatness that had replaced the performance in his eyes. "This is not over," Julian said. "I understand you feel that way," Marcus said. "I will have my attorneys here by Monday morning. Mr. Vance." Marcus's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who had heard this particular sentence, or a version of it, many times before, and who had learned that the most respectful thing you could do for someone saying it was to let them say it, and then continue doing your job. "The keys, please." Julian reached into his pocket. His hand was shaking, not dramatically, not in a way that broadcast itself, but a fine, constant tremor that Tommy noticed, because Tommy was close enough and young enough to still notice things like that. Julian placed 2 keys and a small remote fob on Marcus's open palm without looking at him. Marcus passed them to Tommy and nodded to the locksmith he had brought. The locksmith was a man named Gerald, who had been doing this work for 31 years, and who moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom a door was a door and a lock was a lock, and the human drama on the other side of them was not his department. He started with the front door. The sound of the drill carried out to the front steps clearly in the cold night air. It was at this point Tommy told me that Julian made his move toward the east sitting room. He did it quickly and without announcement, simply turned from the group and walked back into the house with the purposeful stride of a man who had just remembered something he needed. Marcus caught it immediately and sent one of his team members after him, and the team member caught up to Julian inside the sitting room doorway, where Julian was standing in front of the landscape painting that had hung above the fireplace in that room since my grandfather put it there in 1952. It was not a painting most people would recognize. It was not famous. But it was valuable in the specific way of things that have been in a family long enough to become part of what the family means, and Julian had apparently decided, in the compressed and desperate logic of a man who has just lost everything he thought he had, that it was small enough to carry and worth the attempt. The camera in the east sitting room had been recording since 6 that morning, when the estate's security system had automatically activated on its daily cycle. The footage was clear. Tommy told me Julian's face when the team member stepped into the doorway behind him went through something he found difficult to describe, a rapid compression of intention and calculation, and something that might have been shame arriving too late to be useful. "I was just looking at it," Julian said. "Yes, sir," the team member said. "I'll need you to come back outside now." Outside, Marcus confirmed the camera footage on his phone and forwarded it to Raymond with a single line of text. Raymond forwarded it to the appropriate file without comment. When the front door locks were changed, and the new fob programmed, Marcus took the new key and held it for a moment. Then he turned to Tommy. Tommy was 24 years old, the son of a woman who had cleaned offices for 11 years, a young man who had gotten here on a scholarship no one had ever put a name to. He looked at the key in Marcus's hand, and then he took it and put it in his jacket pocket and did not say anything. Neither did Marcus. They didn't need to. I was sitting in the parking lot of a diner on Route 14 when the first message came through. Not the driveway of my apartment. Not some quiet residential street. A diner parking lot, fluorescent light from the window falling in a pale rectangle across my dashboard. The smell of coffee and fried food coming through the ventilation system from somewhere nearby. Because I had pulled off the highway 20 minutes after leaving the estate, when I realized I was not yet ready to in a room with walls around me, and had found the first lit parking lot I could see from the road, and pulled into it and turned the engine off. I had been sitting there for 40 minutes when the phone buzzed. The screen said Chloe. I watched it ring. 4 rings, 5, and then it stopped and the small icon appeared that meant she had left a message, and I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and looked at the diner window for a while. There was a couple inside, maybe 60 years old, sharing a piece of pie. The man was talking, and the woman was listening with her chin in her hand, and every few seconds she smiled at something he said. They looked like people who had been having this particular conversation in one form or another for a very long time. They looked like people who had decided somewhere along the way that this was enough, this specific thing, pie and coffee, and the same person across the table, and had been right about it. Diana and I had done that. Diners, bad coffee, good pie, long conversations about nothing that turned out to be about everything. We had been doing it since our second date, a place in Burlington with sticky menus and a jukebox that only played music from the 1960s, and we had kept doing it for 23 years until we could not anymore. I picked up my phone. I did not call Chloe back. I pressed the voicemail icon and held the phone to my ear. Her voice came through immediately, and the first thing I noticed was that she had been crying before she started recording. There was a roughness in her throat, a slight unevenness in her first breath, the particular acoustic signature of someone who has used up most of their composure and is operating on what is left. Dad. A pause. I don't know where to start. I know you're not going to pick up. I know you. Another pause longer. Julian he's saying things right now that I don't want to repeat. And I know that's not an excuse, I know it's not. But I need you to understand that tonight it wasn't supposed to go like this. None of it was supposed to go like this. Her voice broke on the last word. I heard her pull in a breath and hold it and let it out. I'm sorry about the photographs, she said. I'm sorry about the note in the kitchen. I know you saw it. I know you, Dad. I've always known when you've seen something and decided not to say anything about it, and She stopped. I made choices that I can't. I don't know how to explain them in a way that sounds like anything other than what they were. I sat with that for a moment. Then I opened Raymond's text from 2 hours ago. He had sent me a file, the audio pulled from the estate's security system, specifically the kitchen camera timestamped at 7:42 that morning. I had asked him for it after he mentioned it on the phone, and he had sent it without comment. The estate's security system recorded audio and video continuously in common areas as a standard feature of the smart home package my father had installed 3 years before he died. The kitchen was a common area. The recording was legal, unambiguous, and mine by right of ownership. I put the phone on speaker and pressed play. The first voice I heard was a caterer going over the prep schedule, then footsteps. Then Chloe's voice, and with it a tone I had not heard from her in years, loose and unguarded, the voice she used when she believed no one was listening, who mattered. She was talking to Julian. He's already here, she said. I saw his car in the service lot. Julian's voice lower. Is that a problem? It's annoying. The word landed flat and certain. Just don't engage with him, okay? Let him do whatever he needs to do. He can help with the setup if he wants. It keeps him busy. A pause. Then Julian. Your father needs to understand his place today. And Chloe, without hesitation, without the pause that might have meant she was thinking about it. Honestly, just get him out of here if he becomes an issue. I don't need the stress. I don't need him hovering around making the whole thing feel like... She stopped, and in the stop, I heard her searching for the word, and then finding it like something it isn't. The recording ended. I set the phone down on the passenger seat face up this time, and looked at the ceiling of my car. Outside, the couple in the diner were still there. The woman had said something that made the man laugh a real laugh, his head going back, and she was watching him laugh with the expression of a woman who has spent years collecting that specific sound and is not yet tired of it. I thought about the voicemail, and I thought about the recording, and I sat with the fact of having both of them existing in the same phone on the same evening. Two versions of the same person, separated by 12 hours, and a catastrophe of her own construction. I thought about Diana. Diana would have known what to say in this moment. She had always been the one who knew what to say, not because she was softer than me, she was not, but because she had a particular gift for locating the true thing inside a complicated situation and saying it plainly. She would have taken my hand the way she did and said something short and honest, and it would have been the right thing. She was not here to say it. I reached into my jacket and took out the envelope. I looked at it for a long time. The corners had gone soft. The seal was still unbroken. Then I opened the center console and placed it inside and closed the lid. Not because I was done. Not yet. But because some decisions needed a night of sleep and a clear morning before they became permanent, and I had learned across 70 years of making decisions that the ones you made in parking lots at 8 o'clock at night were rarely the ones you wanted to keep. Raymond texted at 8:23. Everything complete. Tommy has the key. Call me tomorrow. I texted back, thank you. Then I started the car. I had saved Chloe's voicemail, not to punish her, not to use against her, but because someday when enough time had passed and she had built something real enough to stand on, she would need to hear her own voice saying the things she had said, and she would need to hear it without me in the room telling her what to think about it. That was the last gift I had left to give her. Whether she ever claimed it was up to her. A week is a long time when things are falling. I have watched companies fail before, not with satisfaction, not with the particular pleasure some men take in watching their adversaries come undone, but with the professional attention of someone who understands that collapse has a shape and a sequence, and that understanding it is part of understanding how things work. I had watched it happen to competitors, to partners who had overextended themselves, to men I had respected, who had made one decision too many in the wrong direction. I had never watched it happen to someone my daughter had planned to marry. It was a Tuesday morning when Raymond called with the first full summary. I was at my kitchen table with coffee and the day's mail, which was where I had been when Raymond called me with difficult news twice before in my life, and which had become, through no particular intention of my own, the place where I received information that required me to sit down. The cross-default clause triggered Friday night, Raymond said. The bank sent formal notice to Vance Family Enterprises at 9:15 Saturday morning. The full balance, $2.4 million, is due within 30 days. They can't cover it, I said. It was not a question. No, Raymond said. Their liquid assets are significantly below that threshold. Robert had been using the company's operating accounts to service personal debt for the better part of 18 months. That's part of what Kevin Park's piece covers. Kevin Park's article had gone live that morning. I had read it at 6:45, standing at my kitchen counter in my bathrobe, reading a 7,000-word investigation into the Vance family's financial history on a tablet screen while my coffee brewed. Kevin had been working on it for 6 months, and it showed the sourcing was thorough, the timeline precise, the language careful, in the way of a journalist who knows that the people he is writing about have lawyers, and has made sure before publishing a single word that every sentence could survive contact with them. The piece covered Robert's debt, restructuring the business loan, and its unusual guarantor arrangement, the engagement party and what had happened at it, and the video Evelyn had posted, which had accumulated by the time Kevin's article linked to it 400,000 views across platforms. It did not name Arthur Miller as the guarantor. Kevin had called me the previous Thursday to ask if I wanted to be included by name. I had said no. He had accepted that without argument, which told me something about him. Raymond continued. The acquisition of Vance Family Enterprises was completed yesterday evening, he said. Miller Holdings subsidiary shell entity, distressed asset purchase, $1 assumption of debt standard terms for a company with negative equity and no viable path to solvency. The acquisition had been Raymond's idea technically. He had raised it 2 months ago as a contingency if the cross-default clause ever triggered and Vance Family Enterprises became insolvent. A subsidiary acquisition would allow Miller Holdings to control the resolution of the debt, protect the guarantor position, and ensure that the assets were wound down in an orderly fashion rather than a chaotic one. I had approved it and filed it away and not thought about it again until Raymond called on Saturday morning. Julian doesn't know yet, Raymond said. About the acquisition, he'll find out when the creditor notification goes out Thursday. I thought about that for a moment. The ring, I said. Raymond paused. The ring required. The purchase was made on October 14th, he said carefully, using funds withdrawn from an account under your name, the capped discretionary account you established for Chloe's living expenses in 2019. I had established that account when Chloe moved to Hartford after graduate school. A reasonable monthly allowance indexed to inflation, intended to cover the gap between an entry-level salary and the cost of living in a city that had gotten expensive faster than most people's incomes had kept up. I had funded it quietly, renewed it annually, and never mentioned it to her directly because she had never asked where the money came from, and I had never offered. How much was the ring? I asked. Raymond told me. I drank my coffee. All right, I said. There's one more thing, Raymond said. Chloe. She left Julian's apartment Thursday night. According to Helen called me Friday. I hope that's all right? Of course it's all right. According to Helen, Julian told Chloe that what happened was her fault, that she had failed to manage her father adequately, which was how he apparently phrased it, that the entire situation was a consequence of her inability to handle her family. Raymond paused. She's staying in a short-term rental in Wethersfield. Helen has the address if you want it. I did not say anything for a moment. I looked out my kitchen window at the yard behind my building, where a maple tree had lost its last leaves and was standing bare and gray against a November sky that had not decided yet whether it wanted to be winter or just something that felt like it. There was a bird on the fence rail, a cardinal red and improbable in all that gray, sitting there, with the self-possession of a creature that had not been informed that the season made its presence unlikely. Diana would have pointed at it immediately. She would have grabbed my arm and pointed and said something about how they always showed up when you needed reminding of something. I had never been entirely certain what the cardinals were supposed to remind you of, but I had learned over 23 years that the correct response was to stop what you were doing and look. I stopped what I was doing and looked. I don't need the address, I said. All right, Raymond said. Not yet, I said. Raymond understood the distinction. He always did. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a while longer. Tommy had sent me a photograph that morning, a screenshot of Kevin Park's article, the headline sitting above a photograph of the Miller estate taken from the road, the oak trees framing the entrance the way Diana had always wanted them to. The estate looked the same as it always had, solid, patient, belonging to itself. Tommy's message beneath the photo said only, "Thought you'd want to see it." I typed back, "Thank you, Tommy." Then I put the phone down and finished my coffee. People kept asking me in the days that followed whether I felt satisfied. Colleagues, old friends, Raymond himself in an indirect way. They asked it in different forms. How are you feeling? Are you doing all right? Have you been able to rest? But underneath all of them was the same question, which was whether the outcome had given me what I was looking for. I did not know how to explain that I had not been looking for an outcome. I had been looking for a door to close so that I could breathe again without the weight of what was behind it pressing against my chest. Justice does not feel like winning. It just feels like finally being able to exhale. Raymond's office on Chestnut Street had not changed in 30 years. The same oak desk my father had sat across from, the same bookshelves running floor to ceiling on the east wall. The same framed print above the credenza of a New England coastal scene that Raymond had hung there in 1991 and had apparently decided at some point was permanent. The coffee was the same, too dark, slightly over-extracted, served in mugs that said Harris and Associates in small letters near the base, the kind of institutional coffee that tasted less like a beverage and more like a statement about the kind of place you were in and what was expected of you there. I had been coming to this office since I was 26 years old. I had signed my first business contract here. My father's estate documents, Diana's will, the deed transfer for the Miller estate, a dozen other things over 3 decades that had shaped the direction of everything that came after them, the way a small adjustment to a compass heading shapes where you end up after 1,000 miles. Today, I was here to sign the last one. Tommy was already at the side table when I arrived, his laptop open, a stack of tabbed documents to his left, and a legal pad with handwritten notes to his right. He had been an associate at Harris and Associates for 8 months now, having passed the Connecticut bar on his first attempt in the spring, and he had developed in that time the particular quality of a young attorney who has learned the difference between knowing the law and understanding what it is for. He stood when I came in. "Mr. Miller." "Sit down, Tommy." He sat, but his back stayed straight, which told me he was taking this seriously. I appreciated that, without saying so. Raymond came in from the inner office with a folder under his arm, and the expression of a man who has prepared something carefully and is ready to walk through it without rushing. He set the folder on the desk, poured 2 coffees without asking, and settled into his chair. "The Diana Miller Foundation," he said, opening the folder to the first tabbed section. "Filed as a 501c3 charitable organization under Connecticut state law. The application was submitted 6 weeks ago and approved last Thursday. The foundation has legal standing as of December 1st. He slid the first document across the desk. I read it the way I read everything, fully, without skimming, beginning to end. It said what I had asked it to say. The foundation's stated purpose was threefold: the construction and endowment of educational facilities in underserved rural communities, the operation of a vocational training center, providing tuition-free skills, education to adults in transition, and the administration of a scholarship program for first-generation college students. The scholarship program had been operating quietly, without a name, for 15 years. It had funded 47 students through undergraduate and graduate programs. Tommy Callahan had been number 31. He did not know that yet. The initial endowment. Raymond continued, moving to the second tab. Transfers Miller Holdings' charitable reserve fund, in full approximately $14 million, to the foundation's operating account upon your signature. The reserve has been building since 2008. It's enough to fund the first school construction, establish the vocational center, and maintain the scholarship program at current levels for 12 years without additional contributions. I signed the endowment transfer without stopping. Raymond moved to the third tab. The 3 school sites, he said. We've identified locations in consultation with the State Education Board. Harwinton, Colebrook, and Voluntown, all 3 in the bottom quartile for per-pupil spending in Connecticut. Construction timelines are 18 to 24 months. Ground breaks are scheduled for spring. He passed me the site agreements one at a time. I signed each of them. The vocational center would be in New Britain. A building Raymond had identified, a former manufacturing facility, solid bones, good location, reasonable acquisition cost. The center would offer programs in electrical work, plumbing, HVAC, medical coding, and commercial kitchen operation. Free of charge. Open enrollment. No application fee, no income requirement, no prior credential necessary. Diana had believed with the particular conviction of a woman who had grown up without much and made something of it anyway, that the most dangerous thing you could do to a person was convince them that opportunity required permission. The center was the clearest expression I had found of what she meant. I signed the New Britain agreement. Raymond set down his pen and looked at me across the desk. The executive director appointment, he said. You want to do that now? Yes. He nodded to Tommy, who opened a separate document on his laptop and turned the screen to face me. A formal letter of appointment, drafted on foundation letterhead, designating Thomas Edward Callahan as executive director of the Diana Miller Foundation, effective January 1st, 2026. I looked at Tommy. He was looking at the screen, not at me, and his expression was the expression of a young man who has just read something that has reorganized the architecture of what he believed was possible for him, and who is taking a moment to catch up to it. Tommy, I said. He looked up. His eyes were bright in a way he was clearly working to manage, and his jaw was set with the particular determination of someone who has decided they are not going to cry in a professional setting and is committing to that decision with everything they have. I've watched you for 4 years, I said. I watched you work through school on 4 hours of sleep and 2 jobs, and not one word of complaint about any of it. I watched you pass the bar and come here and learn how to do this work the right way, which is not something everyone learns even when they're given the time and the money and the comfort that you were not given. I paused. This foundation needs someone who understands what it's for from the inside. Not someone who studied it, someone who lived it. Tommy's throat moved. Your job, I said, is to make sure this outlasts both of us. He nodded once carefully and pressed his lips together and looked back at the screen. Raymond slid the appointment letter across the desk. I signed it. Then I signed the last page of the foundation documents. The page that made it real, that transferred the intention into a legal entity that would exist beyond me, that put Diana's name on something permanent in a world that had been without her for 12 years. I set down the pen. Raymond picked up his coffee and held it without drinking. She would have liked this, he said. Not as a performance, just as a true thing said quietly in the manner of men who have known someone long enough to speak about them with confidence. She would have had notes, I said. Raymond smiled at that, a real one, brief and unguarded. She always had notes. I signed the last page and felt something I had not felt in years. Not relief, not victory, not the particular satisfaction of a man who has won something. Just the clean, quiet feeling of a man who knows exactly what he is leaving behind. The Miller Holdings offices were on the 14th floor of a building on Asylum Avenue in Hartford, which had always struck me as an unfortunate name for a street where people went to conduct serious business, and which Diana had found endlessly amusing for exactly that reason. I had not been in the office since the week before the engagement party. Walking in on a Monday morning in mid-December past the reception desk where a young woman named Patricia had worked for 11 years and who stood up when she saw me and said simply, "Good morning, Mr. Miller. Welcome back," without making anything more of it than that which was exactly the right thing to do, and which told me, not for the first time, that Patricia understood her job better than most people understood theirs. I felt the particular sensation of a room reassembling itself around a person who had been absent from it. My office was as I had left it. The desk was clear. The chair was in its position. The window looked out over the city the way it always had, the Hartford skyline, low and honest against a December sky that was the particular shade of gray that meant snow before the week was out. Someone had put a fresh legal pad on the desk and a new pen beside it, which was either Patricia or Tommy, and I made a note to thank whichever of them it had been. I sat down. The first meeting was at 9. The partners I was meeting with that morning were 3 men and 1 woman I had been in conversation with for the better part of 2 years, a sustainable infrastructure firm out of Boston, a medical technology company based in New Haven, and a real estate development group from Philadelphia that was doing interesting work in mixed-income housing. These were not relationships I had rushed. I did not rush relationships. I had learned across 40 years of building things that the partnerships worth having were the ones that could absorb the weight of time without buckling, and that the best way to test that was to take more time than seemed strictly necessary before committing to anything. I had been ready to commit for 3 months. I had waited for other reasons. The Boston firm came in first. 2 partners, a woman named Claire Osgood and a man named David Park, who had been in sustainable infrastructure since before it had that name, and who had the particular quality of people who had believed in something when believing in it was not yet fashionable and had been proven right slowly and without fanfare. We spent 40 minutes on the terms. They were reasonable people, which made the conversation straightforward, which made the contract easy to sign when Tommy slid it across the table. I signed it. Claire Osgood shook my hand with both of hers, which was not something most people did, and which I recognized as a genuine gesture rather than a performed one. The New Haven Medical Technology Company was next. Their work was in diagnostic tools for rural healthcare providers, portable imaging equipment, remote monitoring systems, the kind of technology that was valuable precisely because it worked in places where the more expensive version of itself could not easily go. The lead partner, a man named Franklin Greer, who had been a physician before he became an entrepreneur, and who still thought like one, had explained their model to me 18 months ago over dinner, and I had thought about it almost every week since. I signed that contract too. The Philadelphia group came in after lunch. Their project was a mixed-income development in a neighborhood that had been losing population for 20 years, not through dramatic collapse, but through the slow, undramatic attrition of a place that had simply stopped being invested in. The kind of neighborhood that did not make the news because its problems were not loud enough to be news, only persistent enough to matter. They wanted to build 400 units, 30% of them affordable, at rates that would be maintained by covenant for 40 years, the rest at market rate to keep the economics viable. It was the kind of project that only worked if the numbers were right and the commitment was real, and I had spent 2 months verifying both. I signed the third contract at 2:17 in the afternoon. The room cleared out by 3. Tommy gathered the executed copies and took them to be filed, and I sat alone in my office for the first time since I had arrived that morning in the particular quiet of a room that has just finished being productive and has not yet been asked to do anything else. I opened the center drawer of my desk. The envelope was there where I had placed it the previous Thursday, transferred from the center console of my car to my briefcase to my desk drawer, still sealed, still soft at the corners. I had been carrying it for 3 weeks now, which was longer than I had carried anything in recent memory without resolving it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked out the window at the Hartford skyline, where the light was going. The way December light goes fast and sideways, the sun already low at 3 in the afternoon, the buildings catching it at angles that made them look briefly like something other than what they were. Diana had loved December light. She said it was the most honest light of the year because it had nothing to prove and nowhere particular to go. I thought about that. Then I closed the drawer. Some doors did not need to be opened. They just needed to exist so you knew what was on the other side of them. A knock at the door. Tommy with the filed copies and a summary sheet of the afternoon's completed transactions. "All 3 executed and filed," he said. "Copies to Raymond's office as well per your standing instruction." "Thank you, Tommy." He started to leave, then stopped at the door. "Mr. Miller." He turned back. He had something he was deciding whether to say, which I recognized, because I had seen him do it twice before, and both times what he had decided to say had been worth hearing. "That man who asked you about the engagement party," he said. "The partner from Boston, David Park. He asked me in the hallway before his meeting whether what he'd read in the paper was true." A pause. I told him it was. He said. Tommy stopped, recalibrated. He said he'd been watching how you handled it, and that it was the reason he safely decided to sign. I looked at him. He said a man who knows when to act and when to wait is the only kind of man worth doing business with. I did not say anything for a moment. "Tell David Park," I said finally, "that I look forward to a long partnership." Tommy nodded. He left. I turned back to the window and watched the December light finish its work on the Hartford skyline, going gold at the edges, and then quickly and without ceremony going dark. We left on a Thursday, 4 men in our late 60s and early 70s standing at the departures terminal at Bradley International Airport with carry-on bags and the particular energy of people who have decided, after decades of postponing things, that the time for postponing has passed. Gerald Marsh, Helen's older brother, a retired high school history teacher who had known me since Diana and I moved to Hartford in 1989, had organized the tickets, which meant they were economy class and slightly inconvenient because Gerald had been managing money carefully his entire life and saw no reason to stop doing it now. Frank Okafor, who had been my closest friend since we met at a neighborhood association meeting in 1992, and had argued about the proposed parking ordinance for 45 minutes before realizing we were on the same side, carried a bag that was significantly too large for a 5-day trip. When I pointed this out, he said he ran cold. Pete Calloway, a retired electrician who had rewired the Miller estate twice over the years and who had attended Diana's funeral, and said nothing, only stood beside me for 2 hours and driven me home afterward, had a paperback novel in his jacket pocket that he had already read twice. I had a window seat and a thermos of coffee I had made at home that morning. We flew through the night and landed in Reykjavik at 6:15 in the morning. Local time in the dark, which in late December in Iceland was not a temporary condition, but simply the way things were. The darkness there had a different quality than Connecticut, darkness thicker, more deliberate, as if it had been there longer and had no particular plans to leave. Gerald had rented a house outside the city, a low building set into the landscape the way Icelandic structures tend to be, as if they had been persuaded rather than imposed, with windows on the north side that looked out over a flat expanse of snow-covered ground that ran uninterrupted to the horizon. The heating system worked extremely well. The kitchen was stocked. There were 4 bedrooms and a common room with a wood stove that Frank lit within 20 minutes of our arrival and did not let go out for the duration of the trip. We spent the days simply. We drove to see the geysers on the first afternoon, Frank taking photographs of everything, with the enthusiasm of a man who had discovered late in life that he enjoyed photography and had not yet been embarrassed out of it by anyone telling him his technique was wrong. We ate dinner at a restaurant in the city, where the menu was largely incomprehensible to all four of us, and where we ordered by pointing and received in each case something excellent. Pete read his book in the car on the way back, and fell asleep before the last chapter, which Gerald said was consistent with every road trip he had ever taken with Pete going back 30 years. On the third evening, Frank asked about Chloe. We were sitting around the wood stove after dinner, the four of us, with the particular ease of men who have known each other long enough that silence is not something that needs to be filled. Frank asked it directly, the way he asked everything, without preamble, without softening it first, because Frank believed that the kindest thing you could do for a person was trust them to handle a straight question. "How are you with all of it?" he said. "With Chloe." I held my coffee cup with both hands. "I don't know yet," I said. "She's finding her way. That's all I can ask for right now." "Do you think she'll come around?" Gerald asked. I thought about the voicemail. I thought about the recording. I thought about the photograph she had taken with her when she left the estate, just one, and she had held it against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. "I think she's asking better questions than she was," I said. "That's a start." Pete looked up from his book. He had a way of listening to conversations while appearing to read, which none of us had ever called attention to, because it would have embarrassed him, and because the observations he offered when he had been listening that way were usually the best ones in the room. "She's got your stubbornness," Pete said. "That's not nothing." No one said anything for a moment. Then Frank laughed, a real one, and Gerald shook his head, and I looked at the wood stove and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for a long time. The northern lights came on the fourth night. We had driven out past the city to get away from the light pollution on a road that became a track that became a wide, flat space where Gerald parked the car and turned off the engine. And we got out into cold that was more serious than anything Connecticut had offered us in recent years. The kind of cold that required your complete attention and reminded you, in case you had forgotten, that the planet was indifferent to your plans and preferences and had been managing its own affairs for considerably longer than you had been involved. We stood in a line, the four of us, looking north. It started as a smear of pale green at the horizon, barely distinguishable from the dark. Then it moved, not dramatically, not the way it looked in photographs, but slowly and with a kind of authority, folding and unfolding across the sky, in colors that had no exact equivalent in anything I could name. Green at the base, shifting to something between blue and violet at the edges, with a quality of light that seemed to come from inside itself rather than from any identifiable source. Frank was taking photographs. Gerald said something I did not catch. Pete closed his book. I stood and looked at it. Diana had wanted to see the northern lights for as long as I could remember. She had read about them in a magazine when she was 17 years old. She had told me once and had simply decided that she would see them someday, the way she decided things completely, and without much doubt about the outcome. She had not gotten there. The years had been full of other things, good things mostly, and then there had been fewer years than we had planned for, and then there were none. I stood there long enough for both of us. I did not take a photograph. I did not call anyone. I did not say anything to Frank or Gerald or Pete, and they did not say anything to me because they had known Diana and they understood without being told what this particular sky meant to the particular man standing in front of it. The lights shifted and folded and spread across half the visible sky, indifferent and magnificent, doing what they had always done long before anyone was standing in the dark, watching them. I breathed in the cold air and let it fill my lungs completely. Somewhere behind me, Frank lowered his camera. The four of us stood there for a long time. Helen called me on a Sunday afternoon in early December, 3 days after I got back from Iceland, and she talked for 40 minutes, which was unusual for her. Helen was not a woman who used 40 minutes on a phone call without reason. When she finally said goodbye, and I set the phone down on my kitchen table and sat with what she had told me, I understood that she had needed that long because the thing she was describing did not compress easily into a shorter version of itself. This is what she told me. She had driven to Wethersfield on a Wednesday. She had found the address through a mutual friend, had not called ahead, and had knocked on the door of a second-floor apartment in a building on Elm Street with a parking lot that needed resurfacing and a lobby that smelled like the previous tenant's cooking, and a stairwell where the third step from the top made a sound when you stood on it. Chloe had answered the door in a sweatshirt and socks. Helen said she looked thin, in the way people look thin when they have forgotten for a few weeks to take care of themselves as a primary concern rather than an afterthought. Her hair was pulled back without much attention paid to it. There were 2 coffee cups on the counter behind her, both empty, and a cardboard box near the window that had not been unpacked. She had looked at Helen for a moment without saying anything. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider, which Helen said was the most important thing she did that afternoon, and possibly one of the most important things she had done in longer than that. Helen brought cookies. She was very clear about this when she told me she had stopped at a bakery on the way and bought a box of the kind of cookies that came individually wrapped in wax paper, the kind that tasted like someone's grandmother had made them, and she set them on Chloe's counter and put water on to boil without asking if that was all right. Because sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a person is simply proceed as if things are going to be fine and let them catch up to that assumption. They sat at the small kitchen table. Chloe talked first. She talked about the apartment, the things she had not unpacked yet, the job she had started the previous Monday at a communications firm downtown, the commute on the bus, which took 40 minutes each way, and which she had not yet decided how she felt about. She talked around the larger thing for perhaps 20 minutes, and Helen let her because Helen understood that some people needed to establish that they were still standing before they could talk about what had knocked them down. Then Chloe asked about Arthur. Not how he was, she asked what he had been like when he was young, before she could remember. Helen set down her cookie. She told Chloe about the first time she had met Arthur at a dinner party at Diana's parents' house in Burlington, when Arthur and Diana had been together for about a year. How Arthur had helped Diana's father clear the table without being asked, and how Diana's father, who was not an easy man to impress, had leaned over to Helen's husband and said something in a low voice that made her husband nod. Helen had asked her husband later what Diana's father had said. He had said that one knows what things cost. She told Chloe about the years after Diana's diagnosis, not the hospital years, but the years before when they had known what was coming and had chosen both of them to fill the time with ordinary things rather than ceremony. Dinners, drives, Saturdays that looked like any other Saturday. Arthur had kept working, kept building, kept doing every small thing the same way he had always done it, because Diana had asked him to, and because he understood that what she needed was not to be treated like someone who was leaving, but like someone who was still completely here. He had done that for 3 years. Chloe's hands were flat on the table when Helen finished. Her jaw was working in the way it did. Helen told me when she was holding something in that wanted to come out as a sound rather than words. Helen waited. I knew the house was his, Chloe said finally. Her voice was low and unsteady at the edges, the voice of someone making themselves say something they had not yet said out loud to another person. I knew it the whole time, and I told myself it didn't matter, because he would. I thought he would just. She stopped. I thought he would let it happen because he always let things happen, because he never said anything. I thought that was the same as permission. Helen did not tell her she was wrong. She did not need to. He let things happen, Helen said quietly, because he was paying attention. Those aren't the same. Chloe looked at her hands. After a moment, she stood up and went to the window, the one with the unpacked box beneath it, and reached behind the box and brought out a framed photograph. She held it for a moment before turning it around. It was a photograph of Chloe and Arthur taken when Chloe was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, in the backyard of the apartment they had lived in, before Diana's income had grown enough for them to move somewhere larger. Arthur was crouching down to her height, and Chloe had her arms around his neck, with the complete unself-conscious trust of a child who has never had a reason to calculate how much weight a person can hold. It was the only photograph she had taken when she left the estate. She held it against her chest with both arms. "I'm not ready to call him," she said. "I don't know when I will be." She paused. "But I don't want to call him because I need something. I want to call him when I have something to give back." Helen looked at her for a long moment. "That," she said, "is the first thing you've said that sounds like him." Chloe pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright and filling, but she kept her chin level, and Helen said she looked in that moment like someone who had located a version of herself she had misplaced and was being very careful about how she picked it up. At the door, Helen stopped. She had been turning to go, and then she turned back because there was one more thing, and she had decided on the drive over that she was going to say it regardless of how it landed. "Your father never stopped loving you," she said. "He just stopped pretending that love means accepting anything." Chloe did not answer. She stood in the doorway of her small apartment, with the photograph held against her chest, and she looked at Helen with eyes that were working very hard, and the door stayed open until Helen reached the third step from the top, which made its sound, and then she heard it close softly behind her. I did not know if Chloe would find her way back to me. I did not know, honestly, if I would open that door when she did, or what version of open I was capable of by then, or what either of us would find when we got there. But sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in December, listening to Helen's voice tell me that my daughter was asking better questions than she had been asking before, I thought maybe that was enough for now. Maybe that was exactly enough. I have been sitting on the porch of my new house this morning, smaller than the estate, quieter, and mine in the way that only chosen things are truly yours, thinking about everything this family story has cost and everything it has given back. If you take anything from this grandpa story, let it be, this dignity is not something other people grant you. You carry it in and you carry it out, and no one's cruelty can take it unless you hand it over yourself. I have seen men lose everything by confusing silence for weakness. Do not make that mistake. God has a way of returning to each of us exactly what we have spent our lives building, whether that is love or consequence. Do not be like the people in this family story who measured a man by his appearance and missed everything that mattered. And if you see yourself in Chloe, it is not too late to make the call while the door is still open. My personal belief is simple. The quietest person in the room is often the one who has already decided. If this grandpa story stayed with you, leave one word in the comments. Just one. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements created for the purpose of meaningful storytelling. If this type of content is not for you, we completely respect that and warmly invite you to explore other content that better suits your journey.